All right. Our first speaker for TRiRODS is Christopher Lee, and his talk is entitled Python Wrapper for the iRODS HTTP API. Take it away.
All right, so hi everyone. As you just heard, I'm Christopher Lee. I'm here to talk about my project for this summer, the Python wrapper. Uh, so just a little bit more about me. I recently graduated from NC State in this past May, bachelor's degree in computer science. My programming interests recently have been web development and a little bit of game development. And as for my other interests, I've been interested in foreign languages and linguistics and stuff like that, and also music composition. Uh, so that's me. And the project this summer, as you heard, was a Python wrapper for the existing HTTP API for iRODS. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, there is an HTTP API for iRODS, and you can do a lot of things with this. You can authenticate users, and you can manage things like collections and data objects, creating, deleting, and reading and writing, all sorts of things. However, there's a bit of a problem in that before this summer, there were no existing libraries that you could use for this. So if you wanted to use it with Python, JavaScript, or Java or whatever, you had to construct all these requests yourself. And that can be a little cumbersome at times and sometimes difficult to figure out looking at all this documentation and stuff like that. So the objective for me this summer was to create a wrapper for this API client in Python. Now, the first step of that was the design process. And there were two other interns who I had the opportunity to work with who were designing wrappers for other languages. And we wanted to coordinate at the beginning to make sure that while our wrappers would be different in their implementations, there would be some common threads through them so that they wouldn't be too divergent and they would be easier to use if you used one before. So the first thing we decided was we wanted to subdivide the wrappers into classes for each set of operations. So for example, there would be a separate class for operations dealing with collections and a separate one for dealing with data objects and things like that. We also decided that we wanted the functions to return any data fairly directly to the user so that it would be up to them to decide how they wanted to deal with the data they were getting back from the server. We decided on having the wrapper print out or send other information to the user that wasn't returned directly in the by the function, just to make debugging and figuring out issues easier. And finally, we decided on an authentication flow so that the user would be able to create a wrapper and then switch the authentication token that they were using so that they could easily switch between users who they were carrying out operations as. So now let's take a look at the actual implementation. So we're going to look at an example of creating a collection using this wrapper. So the first thing that it does is it checks the parameters and it just makes sure everything's generally okay before trying to carry out the request. So first it checks to make sure that the token has been set. And if it's not, it will just it will let the user know. And then it checks all of the parameters sent in by the user to make sure that they're valid values and that they're the correct type. Just so that before we even try to construct a request, everything looks okay. So then after that, the next step is actually building the request. So as you see here, we set the token in the header, and then all the parameters are set as well in the data. And we send it off and then store the response. And once we have the response, we process it and check to make sure that everything's okay before returning the data to the user. If we get a 200, then we do some checking to see based on what the iRODS server said, we give different different information to the user, and then return the data back to them. And if it's not, we do some different checks and also return the data back. So that's the implementation of it as it is currently. And for testing, I was pretty fortunate in that the tests for the existing HTTP API were actually written using Python. So it was fairly simple to look at those tests as an example, and then to replace all the requests with calls to this wrapper, to this package. So it made it a lot easier to test things, and I was very lucky once again, especially because the tests were very extensive. Now, at one point during the process, we realized there were some things that would need to be refactored. So one of the biggest ones was moving the classes into different modules. So as I mentioned before, the wrapper is divided up into different classes for different types of operations to make organization easier. But initially, I had all of these in just a single module, and it made it somewhat difficult to work with. It was a very long file. And so we decided that it should be split up into different modules, one for each class, and it made it a lot easier to navigate, to work on, and just a lot cleaner in general. And there were some other concerns that were also dealt with at the same time. So for example, initially, when doing parameter checking, the wrapper would just raise generic exceptions, and those were replaced to be more specific and more helpful to the user. The data that was being returned by the functions was also updated to be consistent across all operations and all potential results. The documentation was updated to reflect these changes, and the unit tests were also reorganized to also be easier to work with. And so with all of that, this is how you actually use the wrapper. So the first thing you do after you import it is you create an instance of the wrapper, passing in the base URL of the iRODS server that you are trying to hit as the parameter. And once you do that, you can then authenticate using your credentials. So you call the authenticate function with a username and a password, and that function will return a token to you. Now, the first time you call it, it will set the token for you if it knows that there's no token set. But this is where the set token comes in. If you want to change which user you're authenticating as, then all you have to do is call set token and pass in the token of the user that you want to run these operations as, and it'll switch it for you. So here's an example of that there. And once you've done that, you can call all of the other functions. So to actually do that, we do .collections, .create, and then pass in the parameters that are required by that particular function, and we store the response. And once we get a response back, we can check things like the HTTP status code here, make sure that's all good, and we can check also the iRODS status code and any other data that's returned by the function. So the current status of the project, the majority of operations have been implemented. So operations for collections, data objects, queries, resources, rules, and tickets are all completed, and they all have the unit tests, and they're all working as intended. As for remaining issues, there are still some operations that are yet to be implemented, and there's also some other smaller issues open, things related to housekeeping, and also some quality of life changes, like replacing some of those print statements with the logger and updating the package naming scheme to make it a little less awkward to import. So I feel that I learned quite a lot this summer. First off is my knowledge in Python. Now, I had used Python for projects before, but this was the largest scale project I've ever done in Python. And so there were a lot of things that I had to do that I hadn't had to do before just because my projects were much smaller. So for example, unit testing. Because my projects were so small, I never had to set up automated unit tests for them. But for a project of this scale, that was a necessity. So I feel I'm much more comfortable using Python now than I was before. Another thing that I learned was the rebasing workflow. In my experience up until now, I had only ever used a merge workflow. So it was a really great learning experience and opportunity to be able to be exposed to this new workflow. And I feel a lot more comfortable using Git it's nice knowing that there's a new tool in my tool belt now. Some other things that I learned, I was focus on design. So as I mentioned before, there was a pretty big refactor that I did during the middle of the project. And as I was working on it, I felt that some of the things that I was addressing in that refactor could have been better dealt with if they were a part of the design phase in a more meaningful way. So if I've learned that spending more time on design means less time fixing design flaws later. And finally, communication. The whole iRODS team was very helpful throughout this whole process. There was a lot to learn at the beginning, uh, not about different tools we were using and about the iRODS server, iRODS itself. And they were very helpful in answering questions and making things go smoothly. And I was glad to have them available. So I learned this summer that problems are much more easily solved uh, with when you get help. So that was one of the big lessons for me as well. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Here's the link to the repo. And that was my project this summer.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Do we have any questions from anyone? Okay, we got a hand from Alan. Wanna unmute and you can...
Hi. Um, I was curious whether the existing Python iRODS client had any, you know, influence over any design decisions or one way or the other.
So I did not look at that for this particular project. And I think it was because, especially as I mentioned in the early phase, I was talking a lot with the other interns for design. So I think that my thinking my process for the design was more so with the other wrappers rather than the uh, existing client. But
Right, that makes sense. Sorry, I had a second question.
Yep.
yeah.
While I'm at it, how did you feel about the Git rebase flow? Do you like it? Do you hate it?
Uh, yeah, I definitely think you end up with a lot cleaner of it looks a lot nicer afterwards because while I feel that merging is easier to start with and get into and feels a little less scary, I remember we had quite a mess of a repository by the end of well, for one of the projects I worked on, our repository did not look very nice after we were done with it. And just looking back at all the commits and stuff with the merges, it was quite messy. So I would say that if I were working on a team and they said we're going to use merge or they said we're going to use rebase, I wouldn't feel too strongly either way, but I definitely see why there are fans of rebasing over merging.
Cool, thanks.
All right. I also have one question.
Yes.
What do you feel is the single biggest or most important thing you've learned through working on this project?
I think it would probably have to be that point about design because I remember going through school projects and stuff, we would always complain that the professors were making us design things. But I think I've kind of come to realize that it's a lot more important and a lot more difficult than a lot of times you think initially. And even though I had learned some of these lessons before, having that experience of going through the refactor and just thinking, if only I designed it better, it it really made me realize that this is why you spend so much time on design, because if you don't, it can cause hiccups later that may be a lot more bothersome than the ones that I had to deal with.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.